Good afternoon, and welcome to our weekly seminar series at the Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University. My name is Josh Rutt. I am the Biostatistics and Data Management Core Unit Manager here at the HNRCA. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. As always, we welcome your questions, and please submit them using the Q&A icon on the webinar toolbar and not the chat. Also, please submit your questions to the Q&A as they arise during the presentation. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Emily Ho. I first met Dr. Ho at a conference on statistical developments in geroscience this past summer, where she gave an engaging talk on developing and validating measures to detect early cognitive impairment. And recently, I attended a nutrition-focused webinar where she presented her work on developing a measure of food noise, which was equally impressive. Dr. Ho is an assistant professor at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. She is trained as a quantitative psychologist and a judgment and decision-making researcher. She serves as the scientific director of the NIH Toolbox, leading large-scale efforts to improve digital measures of cognition, motor, and sensation outcomes across the lifespan. She has increasingly recognized the promise of nutrition and non-pharmacological interventions for altering the trajectory of cognitive decline for the better, and has recently developed a measure of food noise, or the persistent thought of food, often unwanted or dysphoric, that may lead to other negative outcomes. Dr. Ho currently serves as a member of the Cognitive Health Committee at the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences. Her work has appeared in journals such as Nature Climate Change, Management Science, and Alzheimer's and Dementia, and has been featured in outlets including Harvard Business Review, Scientific American, and National Public Radio. And with that, I will turn over the microphone to Dr. Ho.
Thank you, Dr. Rutt, for such a lovely introduction. Thank you, and again for Dr. Rutt and Dr. Booth for the invitation on behalf of the center, and of course for Andrea O'Neill for keeping us all going and where we need to be. So today's talk will be about advancing reliable measurement for detecting early signs of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. I'll focus on decision-making, nutrition, and a little bit more. I will confess this will be a little bit of a two talks, and hopefully you'll be okay with that. And I'll explain why. So the first sort of set of the talks will be on the two projects that I have leadership roles in. One is advancing reliable measurement in Alzheimer's disease and cognitive aging, and that's a NIA-U award that was just completed recently. I'll talk a little bit about that study and kind of the findings from that and the ongoing work there. I'll talk about a current study that I'm the lead scientist on, which is advancing reliable measurement for Alzheimer's disease, cognitive aging, and decision-making, where we're aiming to develop and validate measures of decision-making ability to detect earlier functional signs of impairment. And some of you may know that over the last couple years, the sort of phenomenon called food noise has really taken off in the popular literature, popular culture, as well as the academic literature. And I was part of the efforts to develop a measure that characterizes the extent of food noise across patient-seeking populations, and I'll talk about that process as well as the many future directions that we're currently embarking in. So the first part will be on just advancing reliable measurement in Alzheimer's disease and cognitive aging. So some of you may know, but in case you don't, this is one of the most pressing, public issues of our time. 7.2 million Americans aged 65 and older living with dementia. of various types, including the Alzheimer's type. That number is expected to double more than double by 2060. It's got a lot of negative consequences, for the individual, for caregivers, burden on the healthcare system. And so there's a lot of increasing emphasis on could we look at early detection efforts to try to lengthen the runway for intervention, right? The earlier you catch something, the more maybe you can do something about it. And there's very promising studies, the Pointer study, and just kind of other efforts that look at the promise of different kinds of interventions that could potentially mitigate or attenuate cognitive decline that's due to this disease. So I'm a measurement person, so I'm coming at this from sort of a measurement angle, and I'm thinking, well, we have all these measurements, brief computerized measures that you could administer not just, in not just in a clinical setting, not just with a trained, examiner. And could we use those to try to see whether those measures could identify those at risk for dementia, and track their psychological functioning, neuropsychological functioning over time. So the Armada study, the Advancing Reliable Measurement in Alzheimer's Disease and Cognitive Aging study, addresses this need by validating the NIH toolbox. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a bit. We validated it in multiple sites with older adults along the cognitive aging spectrum. So primarily people that were healthy agers to people with mild cognitive impairment, all the way to people who had been diagnosed as having dementia with the clinical manifestations of Alzheimer's. Right, so the goal of this was to validate the NIH toolbox, cognition, emotion, motor, and sensation batteries across different, cognitive trajectories. And there's some extant biomarker data. We had a lot of different characterized samples of adults from 65 to 85. We had a general population sample, an African-American sample, and a Spanish-speaking sample. We also recruited an 85 plus sample of people who were, deemed by neuropsychologists to be of normal cognitive function. And we kind of had them take some of these tests too. The African-American Spanish-speaking samples are kind of ongoing, and I'll give a little bit of that towards the end of this portion. But that was kind of something we were also interested in because those groups suffer from higher prevalence rates of the disease, and they tend to be slower to be diagnosed. It's a few years on average that they are diagnosed after their white counterparts. And we also expanded the NIH toolbox by adding innovative instruments to assess neurological functions, such as a face name test, a vision test, and hearing tests, which since the study was conceived, now vision and hearing has been put in the Lancet Commission has said that these are also risk factors for developing dementia. So we were maybe, without meaning to, maybe a little ahead of the curve because now we have tests that are normed and can be administered. So I'm talking about Toolbox. What is Toolbox? It's a iPad app that includes tests of 4 domains central to health, cognition, motor, emotion, sensation. The cool thing about it includes 50 plus tests, 4 domains. It's been normed from ages 3 to 85. And I'm not going to talk about it at this talk, but we have a new one that goes 3 all the way up to like 90 something. We have a few normative people on our normative sample that are like 103 years old. So that's pretty cool. But for this one, it's just up until 85. Toolbox has been used in over 1,100 institutions internationally. We have a lot of different languages that it's been translated into. It's in a lot of big clinical studies and a lot of research studies. This is just kind of a sample of all the different clinical trials that Toolbox has been used in. Predominantly, it's people are interested in using the cognition battery, but there's a lot of people who are also using emotion as well as motor, and I'll talk a little bit about olfaction. So it's kind of your one-stop shop, common currency as an outcome measure for large-scale epidemiological studies, clinical trials, etc. So I just want to I'll spotlight just the cognition domain tests. So you can see there's a lot of different tests that tap into different aspects of neuropsychological functioning. working memory, oral reading, crystallized memory, episodic memory, visual reasoning, which is a new one, nonverbal like analogy, sort of matrices type reasoning, executive functioning. Face name is one that's particularly relevant to the aging group because you have to associate the names and the faces, and then there's a delay, and then you have to recall and etc. And some processing tests and processing speed tests. So just this quick overview about the study. We had many of these sites followed the same harmonized protocol. We collected NIH toolbox data, a uniform data set, that's the UDS. So that's basically the harmonized protocol that all Alzheimer's disease research centers follow, where they follow the same people year after year. So we were basically able to leverage existing data collection efforts and have them take the NIH toolbox. And they took all 4 modules, which they're 30 minutes apiece, so it was about 2 hours of testing. They were able to do one-year follow-ups, 2-year follow-ups, and 3-year follow-ups. Although in full disclosure, this study happened around 2021, so it was a little hard to get folks, especially folks that were impaired, to come back into the clinic in person. So we have these data. We have it's a well-characterized sample. For some people, we also have extant biomarker data, which was very nice. And so that's, it was an extensive study. So we were really hoping to get a lot of insights from them. So one of the big central questions that this study was trying to investigate was whether the cognition battery could differentiate between people of different cognitive statuses. And I was able to find, and this was just published like 2 months ago, that they are able to differentiate between different clinical subgroups across basically all tests. And you can sort of see that and across all possible differentiators. So as you can see, some of these these effect sizes are quite large. The difference between NC, the normal controls, and the mild cognitive impairment groups is greater than 1. For those of you who are remember your research methods, anything above a 0.8 is considered already quite high. And so in some of these situations, you sort of see a much bigger effect size than I think even maybe we were anticipating. The difference between normal cognition and mild dementia is more than two standard deviations. And that's just the total composite. So you can sort of see how it's decomposed by each facet of the neuropsychological functioning. So that was very cool and promising. One of my colleagues, Rose Jutton, she's now in Amsterdam, she wanted to look at the differences between the longitudinal differences and see how performance changes after 1 year. And so she looked at that, and then she also split it up between people who are biomarker positive and biomarker negative. And you can see that for some of these, the normal controls, the performance stayed more or less the same. But for 3 tests in particular, we saw changes over time due to in the clinical group and people who are biomarker positive. And they're not necessarily the tests you would think, which was kind of surprising to us. So flanker, you would expect, that's executive functioning, so inhibition. Processing speed, that's been shown, so slower to process stimuli. But one thing we didn't expect was the picture vocabulary was also picked up as a signal and actually has a steeper decline than we would expect. We wouldn't really expect a decline at all because it's a measure of crystallized intelligence, which often, not always, is considered a proxy for education. So, education doesn't change very much, especially as you get older. So we think that it has something to do with multi-sensory kind of cues that are being integrated. So what's cool about this test is that, the names, the stimuli name is called out. Like, I think in this case, the right answer is dog. And so the audio will say dog, and you're supposed to click dog. And so you're thinking, okay, that seems pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Yes, but it involves hearing, right? You have to have appropriate hearing to be able to hear the stimuli. You have to have vision. You have to have good vision in order to differentiate like the different, the 4 different things that are being presented in front of you. And you have to have sort of the semantic knowledge to differentiate, a spoon from a dog. So in some ways, this test is actually maybe a bit more complex than we would think. It's not just picking up on accrued knowledge over the lifespan, right? So that was kind of an interesting finding. We also were interested in olfaction. We have active collaborations with folks at Monell, Pam Dalton, who developed this test originally as part of the original toolbox. And so we were able to see that the toolbox scores are able to differentiate across age. You see an age effect, which is cool, but you also see a mean effect by diagnosis, which is also the first time it's been shown in this test. And we were also able to show that there's differences in the scores by diagnosis as well as sex. Essentially, men do a little worse, and additionally, normal controls tend to do better. So similar to what we showed here. We are also able to show that the test is sensitive for differentiating between both normal cognition and people with dementia, as well as normal cognition with the mild cognitive impairment group. So that's very nice. This was very exciting as well. We saw that the olfaction scores are able to differentiate between biomarker status, but that it was not significant for people who had APOE, who had at least one APOE4 allele. So this is sort of, kind of some evidence that biomarker, positive biomarker status is associated with like reduced olfactory performance, but it's not, I would say it's not conclusive. And I know that more colleagues are working on this, and it's something that I think the NIA is interested in as well, looking at olfaction and other sensory outcomes. We had a very talented bioinformatics student who was very interested in looking at decision tree models and basically coalescing all of the toolbox measures, not just the cognition, not looking at the measures in isolation, but looking at them all together. And he was able to show a nice combination of the best prediction model incorporates measures across different health domains. So I think there's this sort of working memory in conjunction with some emotion measures, and he was able to show that that model had very good specificity as well as sensitivity. I just want to briefly kind of talk about the extensions of this work that we're currently preparing and writing up. We're trying to replicate some of these findings in the African American group, which is 100% African American, largely taken from the Michigan ADRC, but also some other groups. And Spanish speakers, I'm very excited about this one in particular because we're seeing some very big effects. And it's nice because the Spanish speakers come from all over the United States. They're not just centralized in one geographical location. And many of them are actually not very well educated. So that's not a sample that's easy to get a hold of, and something that needs to be represented in the literature more. So, and we have one of my students, Maya Ventura, is working on that, who has who identifies as Latino and has an aging grandmother who suffers from dementia. So I think that that's been very insightful for me, at least, to kind of see and hear her lived experience and see how she kind of applies that to these research questions. And she's very interested in the Latino kind of trajectory of cognitive decline. And we have some sort of more methodological, like time accuracy trade-off, like how does that differ across the different clinical groups, and how do they differ across the different executive functioning tasks? And that's a sort of a more methodological question that I'm interested in, like variability across time and across the different clinical statuses, and more psychometric things. So talked about the lengthening the runway to intervention. The best way to lengthen the runway is maybe to look backwards, right? Connecting the dots backwards. So we kind of have some nice cross-sectional and some longitudinal assessments that kind of show that Toolbox has promise in detecting decline. But what if we look younger than 65, right? Should we look younger than 65? And there's growing evidence in the last couple of years that we should. And so the U.S. Preventive Task Force has they kind of ask this question every couple years and say, should we screen for cognitive impairment. And their recommendation was basically that there's not enough evidence to see what the benefits of screening are. And in their, research needs and gaps statement, they said we should focus more on the literature, the field in general should focus more on early detection of cognitive impairment. They should also focus on other outcomes such as decision making, advanced planning, directives, and caregiver outcomes. And then they talk about the need for more consistent definition and reporting of outcomes. So, kind of inspired by this, we were able to start a study that looked earlier, that kind of focused on the midlife, right? That's kind of a focus, like, because so many of these risk factors seem to be modifiable to some extent, looking earlier and earlier could, have a sort of compounded accumulative positive effect if you had an intervention when you were 40 rather than when you were 50 rather than when you were 60, right? So that's kind of the prevailing idea. So we were able to start a project funded through the NIA, advancing reliable measurement. Maybe you're seeing a theme here in cognitive aging and decision-making ability. I'm very honored to be able to do this work and it's ongoing, I'll talk about that, to develop and validate measures of decision-making ability to identify vulnerable adults who may have trouble with daily living, medication adherence, be more susceptible to scams before there's an official cognitive impairment diagnosis. So there's an idea that, like, it's by the time it's detected, it's too late, especially there's some subgroup differences in when they're able to get detected. It's not always clear that people in the primary care setting, are able to kind of identify impairment. And so the idea is, could we look earlier? And aren't there other kind of harbingers of decline, without calling it that? So I'm honored to work on this with the project leadership, Richard Gershon and Sandra Weintraub, who are both at Northwestern. The steering committee includes other experts such as Duke Han at USC, Peter Lichtenberg, who's a well-known geriatrician, gerontologist who specializes in elder abuse, Janelle Hamner, who is an internal medicine physician, who does a lot of work on decision making and quality of life outcomes and promise related kind of work. And the project scientist is Luke Stokel, who's been a great evangelizer of the work, and Melissa Trevino is our project project officer, program officer. After a lot of discussing and a lot of noodling around, we basically came up with 4 domains. We admit there's maybe other domains, but these are the domains we thought we could identify measures that were the most sensitive to early signs of impairment. Functional outcomes, right? Like your, excuse me, like your activities of daily living. Can you, take care of yourself? Can you manage your own housekeeping and do things like remember to take your medication? um, you know, attain and keep employment, things like that. Financial is the ability to manage financial tasks by evaluating, appropriate options and essentially not, suffer or incur unnecessary financial loss. So healthcare is, right, the process through which individuals make choices about their own healthcare plans. So for example, the decision to get a surgery, the decision to, maybe check yourself out of the hospital when you're very sick or not sick, those sorts of things. Non-cognitive emotion is something that people have also been talking a lot about, the effect of emotion on cognitive impairment. So their ability to kind of influence and be aware of their states, rapid changes in moods, and other non-cognitive symptoms have been shown to directly influence your decision-making ability, right? Like the idea of like making a decision in the heat of the moment, or making inconsistent decisions because of your emotional state is something that there's been a little literature on. And so I'll just kind of talk about the project and where we are at the moment. We started to do this evidence synthesis. We wanted to see, are there existing measures out there that kind of, that we could kind of adapt and use already, because we're trying to develop the measures, norm them for a midlife and aging population, and then the hope is to kind of disseminate them in both research settings and clinical settings. So our first question was, should we just kind of look in the literature? So we did. There were a lot of articles. I think we ended up screening about 16,000. We had a very nice team who had a very busy winter break that year, and we were able to winnow this down and look at the measures across different domains. The papers are published. I won't get into them too much. This is just to kind of show that we did a comprehensive scan of the literature. A lot of the measures, each had their own kind of, quirks, which I'll talk about by each domain. So these are some of the research questions. What measures have been used to assess decision-making ability? What modality were they presented in? How were they defined? And can these measures meaningfully differentiate between various levels of cognitive impairment? So long story short, some of the measures, very few measures actually were able to map onto all of those research questions. Some of them were measures that you could really only administer in the lab and is not meant for widespread, dissemination in a clinic or kind of these large studies at scale. Some of them didn't have validity evidence in younger adults, younger adults in midlife, and some of them were in different languages or were very hard to access despite our best efforts. So the one that kind of came out was the financial vulnerability scale that Peter Lichtenberg had created, and that seemed to have some signal with impairment. So what we ended up doing was we took kind of the most promising measures, such as the financial exploitation vulnerability scale. This is led by a research assistant professor in our group, Dr. Bervan Etche. And we looked at subjective numeracy. We looked at a measure of coherence, like basically your inconsistency in thoughts. We looked at personal finance avoidance, like you just avoid thinking about finances. And the idea is that we have all these measures that we're combining, and we're going to try to see which ones can best predict, like your susceptibility to falling for a scam like this, where like it's a sweepstakes opportunity. It's, in my opinion, not incredibly credible, but we're going to try to kind of see which measures predict this sort of thing. And I want to be careful to say that we're not actually scamming any older adults. This is all hypothetical. They don't, we're not trying to trick them in any way. This is all self-report. And that there's like a sort of, there's a precedent to this kind of straight line of research, in that there's a lot of financial exploitation that goes on. There's very nice studies using large Medicare claims data that suggest that if you miss bill payments as early as 6 years before an official diagnosis, that that suggests that financial vulnerability is like a manifesting kind of variable that can clue you into impairment well before the diagnosis actually happens. So that's kind of where this is feeding into. So finance is the most well-established because there's a lot of different disciplines that are interested in this question, from economists to, medical decision making, like lawyers and things like that. There's a lot of elder abuse kind of groups. So there's a lot of movement with finance. Some other measures and domains are a little less explored. So I'll just kind of walk quickly through the measures that we're kind of still piloting. So a lot of measures that we found were semi-structured, which means that you really need someone sitting next to you to do them, which of course makes it hard to detect at scale and kind of scale up. Either that, or they could only be administered by a trained clinician at the doctoral level. So what we thought was that maybe we could use some of these very seminal frameworks that these clinicians use to determine whether someone has decisional capacity, such as Applebaum and Gristle's framework, and basically map items onto that. So we had a very nice time writing some items. We're testing them now. We're piloting them kind of as we speak. And so I'll just give you an example of the item is that, your retired neighbor tore a muscle, can't lift his arm. Because of his injury, he can't drive. There's a routine surgery to reattach the muscle. What works well? That works well, but recovery takes a few months. And so, you're supposed to understand like what is true. You know, it's it's, recovery, it's that recovery will take time. Then what's the main downside of the surgery, right? He can't drive during recovery. And then what should the neighbor do? And then the idea is that he should have the surgery. So that's the idea. And it maps onto these three facets of decisional capacity that have been well studied in the psychiatric literature and the ethics literature, which is, can you appreciate the facts that are laid out before you? Can you understand them? And can you reason through the options to kind of come to, I guess, a coherent choice? So we're doing that. Currently, we have some preliminary data, but it was too much in its infancy to show you. But hopefully, I can provide an update it gets further along. So the idea is that we're piloting and validating these measures. We're going to assess the psychometric integrity of them, look at the item, maybe refine them. These items that I showed you have already been subject to some usability interviews by highly educated folks, folks that don't have as that are not, I believe they're not college educated, geographically diverse. So they've already had the usability piece built in before we did the psychometric refinement, but I'm sure that there will be more as we get more data. We'll develop some scoring rules and normative scores, such as computer adaptive testing, and there's a lot of opportunities to do cool scoring, maybe looking at timing, how long it takes them to respond to the answer, maybe how much they change their answers, because we can, you can look at how many clicks, how many times they've clicked something, that sort of thing. And then once the measures are ready, there's a lot of different samples that we could deploy this in. I'm talking to some colleagues at the United Kingdom who study Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome, which is a kind of a growing population of interest. I'm interested in self-care management, so things like how dementia influences your ability to care for yourself. If you have multiple chronic conditions, right, you have to remember to take certain medications on different schedules and things like that. And so could this battery or maybe certain subsets of it predict successful care management? And can that be detected in the primary care setting? And so that's something that hopefully I'll be able to work on soon. Linking the battery to real world behaviors like driving or wearables. And those are all things that that I and members of our group are interested in looking at, sort of this convergence of self-report to how it actually, kind of is ecologically valid in the real world. Yeah, so I'm very excited about that. So I think that's more or less all my discussions about aging and early detection. But now I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and talk about food noise. And I thought it would be remiss to be in a very nutrition heavy kind of food sciences audience and not talk about some of the other work I've been doing. So one of the very nice things about being a quantitative psychologist who knows a lot about psychometrics and apparently some other things too, is that people, you get to be like John Tukey, who's a statistician, who says the lovely thing about being a statistician is that you get to play in everybody's sandbox. So this is one such sandbox that I was invited to play in, and I want to talk to you. I'll spend the rest of my time talking about this project. So it's a new phenomenon called food noise. If there's anything psychometricians love more, it's being able to develop a measure of a new phenomenon. So that's where we are. I was invited on this project by the chief of nutrition and director of the Children's Nutrition Research Center at Baylor, Dr. David Allison, and we've been able to work in closely with him and his team and some members of my team over the last year and a half, I'd say. Yes. So how did this begin? There were anecdotes from patients describing the unexpected quiet after they were on GLP-1 agonists. So, here's a quote from some patients that our research team, they see. Some of them are clinicians, and I'll talk about who the team is in a bit. I feel it is always on my mind, not in an obsessive, I want food kind of way, but almost like, am I doing the right thing? Am I eating enough or not enough? Was that the right amount of calories? Should that have been more protein? It's this noise all the time in my head, and I'd say it's about 80% of the time. So that's a pretty significant quality of life kind of, I guess like decrement, I'd say. Like if something is on your mind that you don't necessarily want it to be, and it is there 80% of the time. I'd say that's pretty distracting and probably something that should be looked at, right? So this was just published over the summer. We talked about food noise and the various definitions and measurement and future research directions. This is led by Emily Durander at Texas Tech. So so the prevalence of food noise is sort of something that just kind of came up overnight a little bit. As per the Stop Obesity Alliance, approximately 57% of individuals with obesity say they experience food noise regularly. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that GLP-1 medications can substantially reduce food noise. There's discussions about food cue reactivity, such as responses to advertisements, smell, and images being a key driver of maybe food noise across populations, and environmental triggers and stress can potentially amplify food noise even in those without obesity. So it's kind of, been very, a lot of patients are talking about it, a lot of online kind of forums that, have a lot of, treatment seeking populations are talking about it. So this kind of came to our attention, kind of a convergence of um, curiosity, clinical patterns that were being observed, in the doctor's offices, and various people's lived experiences converged to basically suggest that food noise was a distinct concept and worthy of further study. And so we convened a multidisciplinary panel at ASN in 2024, which was in Chicago that year. And it validated the need, that discussion, the day-long discussion, validated the need for a distinct term and also a distinct, well-validated psychometric tool. Food noise was first Googled, as I was saying, in 2006. There's a little blip here, and there isn't a lot of traction until really the last couple of years, where it's really, you see this accelerated increase, almost exponential. It continues to rise even higher today. This is when we checked it in July 2025. I'm pretty sure it's even higher now. Last I kind of did some informal Googling. So it's kind of really taken off as a concept, which is, was surprising to us in many ways. So what's food noise? Hayashi et al. Define it as part of a model of food cue reactivity, where there's heightened and or persistent manifestations of food cue reactivity, leading to food-related intrusive thoughts, maybe maladaptive eating behaviors, and it's propagated and reinforced by external food cues. But I think we're going to argue that it's a little bit more than that it's a bit more than heightened food cue reactivity. The primary reason being that patients are coming to us and saying it occurs in the absence of external food cues, right? So you don't need to have like a picture of a hamburger or, walking by a store to have food noise. It's just there all the time, regardless of whether there's any stimulus. That's, discernible. Food noise occurs outside of normal meal times. And like I said, it's kind of there all the time from what we understand patients are telling us. It's persistent rather than transient. So it's kind of something that doesn't go away, even with time. So those are kind of some things that we've qualitatively observed. The public discourse has kind of converged on this idea that there's a bit of chatter, there's some rumination, there's a barrage of just kind of this thought that can't be kind of disentangled from the individual as much as they might want to, which was all very interesting to hear, that this is suddenly a thing that people had kind of glommed onto a little bit, and they'd said this is food noise and this is not this other thing. So we had some defining characteristics of food noise, such as anyone attempting to control their weight. We think that, they will probably have high food noise, although that's an empirical question. Some key features are dysphoria, so this feeling of discomfort, cognitive burden, persistence, and self-stigma, right? Like you have it and you don't like it. So this is how it's maybe a little different from imagining what your next meal is in a sort of pleasurable way. Like we would say that is not food noise, thinking about a nice meal down the line after the seminar. So we think there's a bit of sort of self-stigma and dysphoria that's kind of associated with this concept and construct. Something that comes up often is, can we already measure food noise? Aren't there already things, is this a rose by any other name? And we have related existing instruments. I won't kind of go through it in full detail, but we did consider the usual suspects, as it were, of constructs that are similar, conceptually similar to food noise, but have sufficient distinctions and sufficient differentiation. And so, for example, food cue responsivity, there's overlap in the sense that there's cognitive burden, but it's missing factors such as the persistence of thoughts, dysphoria, and self-stigma. Same idea with preoccupation with food noise. It does overlap with persistence and dysphoria, but it's missing that scale, and that definition is missing cognitive burden and also the self-stigma piece. So, and it goes on and on. So we're able to kind of map out qualitatively through a lot of different experts and panels that this is something different and new. So at the end of our panel, the expert panel discussion, we converged on a definition, and I'll read out the definition to you now. It's the persistent thoughts about food that are perceived by the individual as being unwanted and or dysphoric, and it may cause harm to the individual, including social, mental, or physical problems. This is sort of the definition that we came up with. We did, and then here comes the fun part where we're able to create the scale. So we always start with a lot of different measures, different items, I'm sorry. And so we ended up with 34 draft items. We looked at content and face validity, which is essentially running it by expert people and asking them, does this kind of register with what you believe this construct is? If not, what could be refined? Is it just that the item's asking the wrong thing? Is it that it's worded inappropriately? Is it that maybe the words are too difficult? Things like that. So we did a face content and face validity assessment with 10 expert clinicians and scientists. Just a rundown of the expertise of some of these scientists and clinicians. Some people have lived experience with it. Some have research constructs similar to food noise. Some are well-known and well-regarded obesity researchers. And so you can sort of see that they're qualified to comment on the qualitative synthesis part of the scale development process. They were used as sort of systematic way to evaluate each item. Is this item likely to contribute to our ability to determine if someone has food noise? So is it differentiating essentially? And is the item clear? So after that, we were able to cut down a few items and get to the psychometric validation part of things. So 3 very brief studies, briefly described, an item analysis, an item testing, factor analysis measure to kind of winnow down and further kind of select only the best items, the most kind of promising items. We did some factor analyses to kind of see what whether the sort of 3 facets, the 3 subconstructs of food noise, like the dysphoria part, whether those kind of were able to be statistically differentiated and empirically proven. We use some fancy techniques for that, which I won't get into for the interest of time. We did some retest reliability, and yeah, kind of go. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Rita Wang, who's a postdoctoral associate at Baylor, who did a lot of the lion's share of these analyses. So we had 29 items. So after the 34, we dropped a few because of the reasons that I described. We had 29 items tested in a sample of 281. We had very strict and robust attention checks. That design was helmed by Dr. John Agley at Indiana. He was able to kind of show that, like the kind of usual attention checks are not sensitive enough. And so he was able to come up with some creative ones to make sure we were getting really, really high quality data. We did inter-item correlations, looking at test reliability, looking at factor analyses, right? Some of these items were removed already, they're resulting. And we've removed further ones due to the just looking at the empirics. They had low correlations with the rest of the scales. They had weak factor loadings, which just means they didn't map onto the construct as well as we wanted them to. And we resulted in a 23 item scale. So these are examples of items that were dropped. We then did a second factor analysis looking at the construct validity and item reduction. The second prolific sample was surveyed to cross-validate the factor structure. So we wanted to replicate our existing, the kind of findings we saw from study 1. And then through that, we were also able to, being cognizant that a lot of these measures are going to be administered in, time scarce settings, like in a doctor's office, or maybe a clinical trial where this is a lot of one measure and a lot of different, in a longer battery. We also were able to devise a short form 7-item version that has pretty highly correlated with the 23-item version and maintains all the sort of desirable statistical and psychometric properties that you'd want. So that was quite nice. So now we have sort of one for research use if you want longer questionnaires, and then one for a more clinical setting. So these are, I'll just walk very quickly through some of the items and the measures. There's preoccupation with food. I think about food all the time, even when I'm not hungry or eating. Every day I wonder if I have some of the foods I might want to eat later. So this is definitely a preoccupation with food kind of items. Then we have persistence in thinking. So the bold are the ones that are in the short version. When I start thinking about food, I find it difficult to stop thinking about it. When I push thoughts out of food out of my mind, I can still feel them, in the back of my mind. So this is just like a persistence in thought that's not entirely wanted, I guess. And then the dysphoric factor, which is that you maybe really dislike yourself, that you can't control your thoughts about food. You don't like that you always have food on your mind. And these intrusive thoughts are unexpected, hard to control, unwanted. We have a lot of different convergent and divergent validity measures. So you can sort of see that there is similarities between general food craving trait, but it's not like 0.99, which would be evidence that there's conceptual and empirical redundancy. There's it's moderately correlated, but not super correlated with things like social desirability scale and things like weight and shape concern. So this is just some evidence of how our measures correlate as you would expect with some measures and how some that don't correlate at all. And more work is being done on this. We had some item response theory analyses that basically show that the measure is good at distinguishing people who have high food noise. This just tells us that each measure, each item, most of them have very high information, which is very good at the high levels. People who have high levels of food noise, we're able to differentiate them. And just to show that we did an IRT analysis that can provide slightly more granular scoring if people are interested in that. Test-retest reliability is generally pretty high. 0.89 is very good. I think anything above 0.7 is considered quite good. 0.89 is very good. And what's also cool is that the factors are also pretty high. Yeah, also pretty high. So I've kind of shown, a little whirlwind tour that there's a lot of robust ideation and refinement that went into this food noise scale. We're able to show that we are not just measuring food noise, whether you have it or not. We're also looking at a comprehensive construct coverage that maybe we can start studying some psychological mechanisms underpinning food noise. And this measure allows us to do that because it doesn't just ask whether you have the presence of food noise or not. And there's lots of novel and new frontiers that we're tackling even as we speak. So I'll just kind of talk very briefly through some of them. There's areas of future research, such as developing diagnostic criterion for the measure, using the RAID-FN to measure food noise as a trait versus state, validating it in other populations, such as different languages. We have a Spanish translation that's already validated, and we're working on Turkish and Danish and some other ones this week. Children and adolescents, right? These measures were validated right now in adults, but we could maybe adapt them for children. Responsivity of this measure to different kinds of treatments. And just last week, we got invited to the National Academy of Medicine annual meeting to talk about food noise and and this emerging domain and the research there. This is not possible without an amazing, massive team of multidisciplinary team across the nation, led by David Allison and Emily Dorander. And so I'll just kind of leave the names here and just say, and it's an excellent team to work with. In short, I was able to hopefully enlighten you on some of the fun things that are going on in the measurement world related to aging. Lots of different measures being detected, being measured, and lots of different measures that we're hoping to kind of, proliferate into the research and clinical space in the coming months. I'm very excited about looking at the decision-making measures because I think that is in some ways what matters the most to patients, right? They are interested in how they're able to navigate everyday experiences, everyday life, um, you know, and being able to detect that earlier and being able to give patients who are suffering and their families more options, I think can only be a good thing. And I'm happy to be part of it. I'm happy to be part of it in these ways. And food noise is also another very, very, I think, high impact project that already we kind of see that there's a promise in looking at these differences in food noise and kind of changing and increasing the quality of life for patients that have long suffered from something that maybe now they don't have to suffer as much anymore. So I think with that, I will close. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the center again for inviting me, and Dr. Joshua for helping organize along with Andrea O'Neill. And these are my acknowledgments and grant funding, and I think I can take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ho, for an excellent talk. I'll try to only ask one question and then I'll get to everyone else's first. And please feel free to add additional questions into the Q&A. First of all, excellent talk. Regarding food noise, to me, it sounded very similar, if not exactly, to what I've heard people I know describe to me about their experiences and challenges with regulating their diet. And so do you think that the food noise measure, the RAID, FN,
I should
would
mention
be
it's like the RAID Allison, Indiana, yeah, that's what RAID stands for, and the FN is the food noise. Sorry, I should have mentioned that.
okay, so RAID FN, okay. Okay, yeah, so do you think it would be valuable in examining associations with food choices and diet, maybe even like dietary scores like the Healthy Eating Index or mind
Yeah,
health scores, perhaps in different regions or populations?
yeah, I think that's an excellent writing notes down, an excellent next kind of foray, right? Like how do people's baseline, food noise measures, food noise, I guess, performance predict, right, suboptimal food choices versus not. Yeah, there's some interesting work done on like you're more likely to choose healthier options when like you pre-select versus when you're
Mhm.
at the store or at the meal. And so those are very interesting, I think, other benchmarks that we could look at. And I'm going to write that down for our study team. Thank you.
Okay. And okay, so next we have uh, Larissa Constantino, exciting research on olfaction. Am I understanding correctly that women had better olfactory function, and do healthy females have better sense of smell than males? And have you tried adjusting your results for smoking?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I understand it, and I'm not an olfaction expert, but as far as I understand it, I think women do tend to have better function on a healthy sample. And we didn't have enough, we did not adjust our results for smoking. We adjusted it for, the education and other kind of covariates, but not smoking. And that's probably, I'm not fully sure we have access to that. It's possible the UDS, the sort of harmonized protocol everybody uses, may have this data extant. Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Uh, and from Emily Durender, great talk, Dr. Ho. One question is, if accurate early detection of cognitive impairment is possible, and it seems you are all making great progress in that direction, are there evidence-based interventions that can delay progression?
Yeah, so there's increasing evidence that yes, there are evidence-based interventions that can delay or delay progression. The big one that was just unveiled at the big Alzheimer's Association conference this summer, so like 3 months ago, was the US Pointer study. It was a 2-year clinical trial on lifestyle interventions to protect brain health. And basically, they showed that an intensive multi-domain lifestyle program, so it focused on increased physical exercise, diet, cognitive training, like cognitive engagement kind of tasks, and also social interaction was able to improve cognition. I think the effect size was like kind of delaying it for like 1 year or 2 years, I think something like that, which was very promising. And it was only 2 years, and they recruited from like kind of a population-based sample, so it wasn't a convenience sample. So that implies that there's obviously a lot more generalizability. And I believe that was led by funded by the Alzheimer's Association, funded and led by, I believe, Dr. Laura Baker at Wake Forest. So
Okay.
thank you for the question.
Yeah. And a question from Christina Moraga. It was interesting to hear that GLP-1 interventions attenuated experiences with food noise. Would you expect the same results with therapy-based interventions?
Possibly, but that is a wide open empirical question that I do not know the answer to. So I will also take this back to our team. I don't know. Yeah, we're still like the question about GLP-1 interventions is like I'd say as far as I know, it's anecdotal, but it's like so anecdotal. It's so the sort of chorus is so persistent in saying that like a study will probably be run soon, and we'd expect to see that. But I want to be careful and say there has, as far as I know, not been sort of a pre-registered clinical trial that tests exactly that. And so therapy-based interventions is probably the next step after that, or some combination, right? Combination of therapy as well as the pharmacological ones.
Okay, great. And a question from Ellen Messer. Any studies of food noise related relative to food insecurity? So the timing, seasonal and ritual seasonal cycles, or maybe ultra processed food in the diet?
Hmm. Yeah, the extent to which this measure is or this idea is malleable is something that I think we're still discussing internally. It does have strong test retest reliability properties. So, and so it's like over, let me verify, it's like over a 2 week period. Usually that's the standard test retest. It's like pretty high. And we don't control for like time of day. It's not like we ask them all to take it in the morning before their first meal or anything like that. So how malleable this effect is to kind of what I'll call like sort of facile cues in the environment is, I want to say it's more robust a phenomenon than that, just based on the evidence that I have right now.
Okay.
And I know less about
And
ultra processed foods. I'm sorry, so I can't answer that part of the question.
okay. And a question from Maxfield Rubin. If you were advising someone starting out, which core methodological skills are most critical for designing and validating new measurement tools that can survive outside the lab or clinic?
Wow, that's my favorite question. So yeah, I think that psychology and psychometrics and measure development does sometimes suffer a little bit from like you've developed a measure that has really neat properties and it checks all the boxes and here's the 20 cutoffs and they all hit those targets and then what, right? So something I do in some of my scale development work is I try to incorporate in the beginning phases of the measure development and the item refinement some proxy for the behavioral outcome that I want to achieve. So in what I just presented with the the financial measures, right? I have some kind of self-report measures of the, how credible is this, like obviously not credible stimuli, and I try to incorporate measures like that so that you kind of have tentative preliminary tests of behavioral and predictive ecological validity. Sometimes that's not as easy to do. Like, for example, I'm trying to think. Sometimes you want like one thing, like you want one test to predict something 4 years down the line, and like that's just not, you're just not able to do that in a pilot testing setting. But anything you can get close to the your desired, I guess, like real world outcome of choice would be helpful, and incorporating that early. So yeah, I think for example, for some of the other ones we're doing for appreciating a choice, for the healthcare measures that we're trying to see, oh, can someone like answer these and can they appreciate a choice? And what we're going to do is for our external measure, our kind of desired behavioral outcome measure, we're going to have people read a research protocol and have them see whether they understand the research protocol. It's like a real research protocol, and have
Mhm.
and that's kind of like sort of a comprehension task. And I think that that paradigm is not very common in test measurement, in at least in psychology. And so
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at time, and I'm sure I will think I have a few other questions. I'm sure I will, and others will think of many others soon after. So thank you, Dr. Ho. It was great to hear of these cutting edge and clearly important findings with a lot of implications and methods. And thank you for a very clear and informative presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rutt, for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you again to everybody who yeah, who stayed. So